Hello everyone, my name is Mark Bleil, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Pope Paul VI's encyclical written in 1968 called Humanae Vitae, or On Human Life. This is an encyclical that I was not familiar with at all. I certainly heard of the controversy that the encyclical created in the church. And that's really who I'm speaking to today, is really us in the Catholic Church, with the understanding that the world is going to have a hard time accepting the authority of the Catholic Church and the moral theology of the Church under the disorder of original sin and their sinfulness. So I think we have to have the proper expectation of what we can expect from the world. But I am talking to us in the Catholic Church who have the grace of God and have made that commitment under the covenant to follow the commands of God. So Pope Paul VI begins the encyclical really talking about marriage and the sanctity of marriage. He talks about the human being created in the likeness of God. And what's interesting, he talks about how marriage between a man and woman are really the means that God uses for his creation. So as man and woman married in a valid sacramental marriage, as we know it to be now, we are participating in God's creative plan. So he starts there. And he also talks about the church's authority through the magisterium to instruct the church. And I think that's kind of where the problem lies with Catholics, is we tend to we tend to get confused. We think that we are to obey Jesus Christ, and we can sort of take and leave what the magisterium is teaching us. And I think the problem there is that we do not see Christ and the church as one. We don't see the head and the body. And that goes to really Pope Paul VI's encyclical. He talks about marriage, and he talks about being the union of a man and a woman. Certainly the Bible talks about marriage and that union of fidelity and that openness to procreation as really being the means of becoming one flesh with our marriage partner. And that's really the key that he begins with. God has created us in his image, and he has given us the proper instructions on how we are to operate in this world. So when we talk about contraception, we're talking about an artificial blocking, really, of the plan of God. A man and a woman who take the marriage vows have to be open to not only fidelity, and we're certainly aware of the Catholic Church's view on marriage, that it's a sacrament, that marriage is indissoluble, a valid marriage, and also the view of marriage really being a representation of the church and Jesus Christ. So let's talk a little bit about some of the ramifications of contraception, because to be honest, I didn't really have a tremendous understanding of really what the problem was. And, you know, the world will make the argument, particularly those who want to vilify the church's stance on abortion, that, well, you're against contraception, so therefore aren't you in some way contributing to the scourge of abortion? Pope John Paul II really sought to put that to rest in his encyclical, The Gospel of Life, and I want to refer to that in a moment, because that really helped me sort of put Pope Paul VI's encyclical in context. So what I want to talk about is why is contraception forbidden? Well, Pope Paul explains, after giving us a teaching on marriage itself, is that an artificial means of interfering with one of the two necessary and fundamental pieces of a marriage, which is the openness to children, is interfering with God's plan. We do not have that authority to do that. And I guess if it just stopped there, it may not be as powerful. But Pope Paul VI talks about what are the ramifications of this. Okay, maybe in our fallen minds we can rationalize, hey, I don't want to have 10 kids. Okay, and Humanae Vitae is not advocating for that. In fact, it takes into consideration responsible parenthood, which basically says, okay, you can certainly take those issues into consideration. He's not advocating every family have 20 children and not being able to feed them. What he is advocating, though, is that if we do not abide by the means that God has given us to participate in his work of creation, it creates significant problems. And Pope Paul VI warns of those problems in this encyclical. One of those issues is that if we take a fundamental part from marriage, we begin to do damage to the institution itself. For instance, if marriage is no longer a means by which we're participating with God in his creative plan, then what is it, and what does it open itself up to? Well, he says it opens itself up to an attack on the other fundamental part of marriage, which is fidelity. I mean, if the sexual act now is simply maybe a means for just pleasure, then that leads to infidelity. It means if I'm not following God's plan, and if it's no longer open to having and raising children, then what then prevents me from just using the sexual act as a sheer form of pleasure, therefore breaking down the marriage institution completely. So he says it leads to infidelity. What else does it lead to? It leads to using the sexual act simply as a means of pleasure, therefore using the spouse as an instrument, as an item. dehumanizing the other person in the marriage simply as a tool. And I'll kind of get to this and as I talk about Pope John Paul's encyclical on how contraception leads to a degrading of humanity. So Pope Paul VI uses those two issues. So, or he talks about those two issues. So one, if you're not open to having children, you take away a fundamental part of the marriage institution that can lead to infidelity. It can lead to the using of the other person in the marriage as an object. He also wants to point out his warning that the state can interfere with the family by means of contraception as well. And we've certainly see that now in our society. What was interesting to me is that because even that was hard for me to sort of grasp until I read the encyclical. And I think that's probably a good piece of education for us is before we get all worked up about these magisterial teachings, we ought to read them. But how does it then transfer to the issue of abortion? Well, Pope John Paul in his encyclical, The Gospel of Life, talks about contraception when you take procreation out of the act of sexual intimacy. It begins a paradigm shift in which now the sexual act simply becomes an act of selfishness. And the life produced, whether we block it artificially or not, or we kill it after conception, becomes an enemy. So the life, which at the beginning was the plan of God, that a marriage between a man and a woman would produce life. When this is taken out of it, and when this is taken out of our society's psyche, life becomes an enemy, and therefore we kill it. Like any form of action we take, it begins in the mind. It begins with a shift, a worldview. So although Pope John Paul II in the Gospel of Life talks about contraception and abortion being two different levels of evil, obviously abortion being the killing of a human being, he does include contraception as really playing a role in abortion, leading to more abortions, leading to a paradigm that devalues life, dehumanizes not only the partner in a marriage through contraception, but also the life produced as a result of the union. Now, what does this mean for us as Catholics? Well, first of all, it means that we are under obligation, and the reading from the Mass today certainly is to love one another. Okay? And what does that mean? Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. So we have to understand that when Jesus said, he who hears you hears me, and him who sent me, we have to understand that the teaching from the church is the commandment of Christ. We also have to understand that we are created in the image and likeness of God, and God, for lack of a better way of putting it, has given us instructions on how we are to operate to get through this thing called life, to quote Prince. Rest his soul, hopefully. And anytime we take away or ignore those instructions, it creates not only problems for ourselves, but a problem for society. Obviously, abortion is a scourge. This is a sin that cries out for justice. So, if we're going to be pro-life, truly, as Catholics, then we have to understand that to be pro-life, we have to be pro-marriage between a man and a woman as a representation through grace of the relationship between Christ and his church. We have to defend marriage. Not only defend marriage, but defend it in a way that understands how marriage is meant to operate through the commandments of God.